The First World War was an epic and bloody conflict between nations across the globe. It was set into motion on the 28th of June, 1914, when Archduke Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated by a Bosnian Serb student named Gavrilo Princip, causing Austria-Hungary to declare war on Serbia, which caused Serbian ally Russia to oppose Austria-Hungary, which in turn caused Germany to enter the war against Russia and Serbia. France, who was allied with Russia, joined the war, and soon the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary. From there, the war would escalate and expand to the far reaches of the planet. As countries were conquered or occupied, they were often forced to switch allegiance, or in the case of Italy, who was a member of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary prior to the war, a promise of being granted territory in Austria and the Ottoman Empire led them to side with the Allies in opposition to their pre-war arrangements. It was not just nations that switched sides during the war, as individuals sometimes attempted to defect from one army in an effort to join another, although this was a dangerous practice. Even so, one man, Pierre Alderton, managed to accomplish it repeatedly, making him surely the greatest defector of all time. Pierre Ivan Alderton was born in Bordeaux, France on January the 23rd, 1895. His father, Desmond Alderton, was originally from England, and his mother, Irina, had immigrated to France from Russia. Consequently, Pierre was given a name that reflected his French, Russian, English identity and learned to speak all three languages proficiently. Always a bright student with a gift for language, he also learned to speak passable German, Hungarian, and Dutch, as well as a smattering of Turkish and Japanese. In his youth, he made money translating foreign books into French, and planned on going into a diplomatic career as a translator after college. But when France entered the war on the 3rd of August, 1914, Pierre was called to service and joined the French army at the age of 19. At first, young Pierre was caught up in the patriotic fervor of the war, but after being assigned to the Western Front and experiencing trench warfare for the first time, he quickly soured on the romanticized image of war that he had entered the conflict with. Because of his linguistic felicity, he was often called upon to interrogate prisoners, which caused him to develop a real sense of empathy with his supposed enemies. Instead of being barbaric savages, as he had been led to believe, he found that they were actually just scared young men such as himself, who would rather be on a picnic with a beautiful girl than attacking a total stranger with a bayonet. The turning point for Pierre was the incompetence of many of the French generals, who rigidly adhered to antiquated battle strategies that were no longer applicable to modern warfare and frequently resulted in tremendously high casualties, symbolized by a popular phrase of the time, that French soldiers were lions led by donkeys. Pierre's first defection might charitably be called an act of survival, or at least opportunity. While participating in an advance on the enemy position, Pierre was knocked unconscious by a blast and woke up later realizing that he had been left for dead in no man's land. To his horror, he saw a small party of German soldiers cautiously searching the field and realized that he would likely be captured or killed on the spot, and quickly decided to switch uniforms with a dead German who was lying nearby. When the search party reached him, he just groaned loudly and feigned incoherence, mumbling a few words in German. The deception worked, and he was transported to a hospital tent where his wounds were tended to. Fortunately, Pierre had some experience in amateur theatricals, and was able to convincingly portray a man with partial amnesia. He claimed that he vaguely recalled his name being Franz Liebken, and that he was from Dusseldorf, but could remember little else prior to the explosion. His hope had been to find a convenient moment to slip away during the night, but unfortunately he was sent to a hospital away from the front lines, and had to maintain his charade longer than anticipated. At the hospital, Pierre met an attractive young nurse named Greta Mueller, who seemed to take a special interest in helping the wounded man recover his memory. Life in the hospital was a pleasant relief from the misery of the trenches, and he enjoyed better food, sleeping in a bed, and the constant attention of Greta, so much so that he found it difficult to motivate himself to attempt an escape. There was one complication, in that many of the phrases Pierre had learned had come from translating German books, most of which had been erotic in nature, such as Lulu de Cortisana and Die Tochter des Bauern, which caused some uncomfortable interactions. Unfortunately, once his physical injuries had healed, he was sent back to the front line, as manpower was needed, and a soldier with amnesia was better than no soldier at all. Pierre now found himself back in the same situation he was in before, only now he was facing his old comrades and countrymen. At first, Pierre planned to perform a reverse on his original scheme, and switch places with a dead French soldier on the battlefield, and then report back to his lines claiming he had been captured by the Germans but managed to escape. Unfortunately, this plan was thwarted when Russia invaded East Prussia, and the German army was forced to rush troops there. Suddenly, Pierre found himself on the Eastern Front, with no clear plan of how to get back home. Since Russia was allied with France, and Pierre's mother had trained him to be fluent in Russian, he decided to try and sneak away from the trenches and find a farmhouse where he could steal some civilian clothes, and then make his way to the Russian lines where he would present himself as an escaped prisoner. The plan went well at first, until he was discovered hiding in the barn by the farmer's daughter. Fortunately, in this case, his knowledge of the book Die Tochter des Bauern proved to be extremely useful, and Pierre passed a pleasant night in the hayloft before returning to his journey. When he eventually made his way to the Russian lines, his ability to speak the sentry's native language was impressive, but his story about being an escaped POW was met with some skepticism, and he was accused of being a German spy and threatened with execution. Thinking quickly, Pierre admitted that he was indeed a spy, but a French one, who had infiltrated the German ranks to gain information about their tactics and troop movements. His story, told in both French and Russian, was so rich in detail that he largely convinced them of his veracity, although he was put under watch while the details of his narrative could be confirmed. Of course, he had fabricated the whole tale, so he couldn't afford to wait around for too long, but his Russian ancestry and his mastery of the language ingratiated himself to his new comrades, and he was introduced to communist ideology for the first time. Convinced that he was some sort of master spy, several communist members within the ranks conspired to free him if he would travel to Russia and report to their contacts on the deplorable conditions at the front and low morale of the Russian army. Pierre accepted their invitation at once and was slipped out of the camp under the cover of darkness, allegedly on his way to Russia. Of course, having no particular interest in communism, nor a desire to travel to Russia, Pierre appears to have spent some time wandering around East Prussia before turning up in what is today known as Poland. The land was then divided between the German, Austrian, and Russian empires, causing Polish soldiers to fight for both sides in the war. For Pierre, the challenge was to avoid armies of any nationality, which he miraculously seems to have accomplished reasonably well. Eventually, he made it to the coast and talked his way aboard a Polish fishing ship, which turned out to be a front for smugglers. With his ability to speak many languages, Pierre made himself useful to the crew, as he could go ashore in many different ports and communicate with their contacts in the black market. Pierre was rather enjoying this life of adventure away from the carnage of the battlefield, and might have tried to remain with the smugglers for the duration of the war. But their boat was accidentally torpedoed by a German submarine, and he drifted on some debris in the Baltic Sea until a British Navy ship rescued him. Pierre was in poor condition from his ordeal, and not prepared with a story that would appease British sailors, so he offered scant details about his background. But his proficiency with the English language convinced them that he was some sort of friendly non-combatant, and he remained on the ship until they returned to England. The authorities there were less charitable than his naval companions had been, and suspected that he was either a spy or a deserter. Unfortunately, they couldn't figure out from which side. Ultimately, they conscripted him into their army and sent him to the Middle East as part of Britain's Mesopotamia campaign against the Ottoman Turks. British and Indian troops had been deployed to Mesopotamia, what is today known as Iraq, primarily to secure the oil fields near Basra. The fighting against the Ottoman Turks had been fierce, and the climate unforgiving, and it was into this exotic theater of war that Pierre now found himself. Although he was not proficient in Turkish, he was able to make himself useful once again in the interrogation of captured troops. Pierre appears to have served with distinction during the campaign, but his sense of identity was becoming blurred. He had crossed so much of the globe and assumed so many different nationalities that it was hard for him to remember his home in France and his life before the war. All he could think about was the senselessness of the entire enterprise. Why were so many young men sent so far from home to engage in wholesale slaughter of people they had more in common with than opposition to? He no longer cared about nations and borders and political ideologies. His only wish was to survive the war, but he would have one more uniform to wear before seeing that eventful day. The United States had remained technically neutral for nearly the first 3 years of the war, but the sinking of the RMS Lusitania by a German U-boat, costing the lives of over 1,100 people, including more than 120 Americans, and the Zimmermann telegram, a secret diplomatic effort to get Mexico to ally with Germany should the United States enter the war, finally pushed the Americans into the fray on the 6th of April, 1917. It marked a significant turning point in the war, although it would take some time for the Americans to mobilize and be ready for actual combat. The Germans hoped to deliver a swift blow to the Allies before the Americans could arrive in strength, and instigated the Ludendorff Offensive in March of 1918. The main focus of the four-pronged attack was to strike the British forces on the Western Front, from the Somme River to the English Channel, hoping to destroy the main body of the British Army, and forcing France to sue for peace before the Americans could bring their weight to bear on the conflict. At some point during the Mesopotamian campaign, Pierre had become seriously ill and had ultimately ended up back in England, before being sent to the Western Front upon his recovery, having come nearly full circle in returning to the battlefields where he had begun the war in the French army. It is not entirely clear how or why Pierre ended up in the American army by the end of the war, but there appears to be evidence that suggests that it happened, whether by choice or accident. What is known for certain is that when the Americans were shipped home, Pierre went with them and started a new life in the United States. There are those who claim that Pierre changed his name to Peter and worked at a variety of jobs, such as doll maker, streetcar conductor, bank teller, and waiter at a restaurant that specialized in Russian food. But given his linguistic prowess, it is far more likely that he found work as a translator or interpreter, as he had intended to do before the war interrupted his plans. It is unknown whether he ever returned to France or communicated with his parents, who had been informed officially that he was missing in action. Perhaps he felt a sense of shame for having abandoned his nation, or feared that he would be arrested for desertion, or perhaps he had simply been too many different people to recognize the young man he used to be. He had been in the French, German, Russian, British, and American armies, as well as spending time with the British Navy, and also as a Polish smuggler. He had traveled thousands of miles, experienced vastly diverse cultures, and witnessed devastation, brutality, and carnage. And despite having been wounded and seriously ill, he survived the entirety of the war, unlike the tens of millions who had perished. In the end, it is difficult to say whether Pierre Alderton was a coward and traitor, or simply a very lucky and resourceful man who saw war for what it was and spent the rest of his life trying to turn his back on it.